what can we do to avoid glyphosate and other toxic substances?
Well, there's a lot of different toxic substances, and that's kind of like I don't even know how to answer that. But glyphosate, I mean, avoiding glyphosate, I think the most important things that you could do would be to avoid like if you eat grains, eat if you eat grains and like especially corn and soybeans, um, but just like seeds in general, like taxonomical seeds, grains, legumes, etc. But especially corn and soybeans. Then at least make sure they're organic and try to make sure that they're really organic. Um, the Cornucopia Institute they're not glyphosate based, but they do keep track of which organic brands tend to be like fake organic versus real organic because ever since the USDA took over organic labeling, they've destroyed it. And part of the way they've destroyed it is by watering down the existing standards that were formerly uh, regional farm associations were in charge of the standards, and so they've watered them down. But much more importantly, they their penalties for corporations blatantly violating them have been like slaps on the wrist, like $5,000 fines and stuff like that. And so for like a giant corporation um, to have an organic subsidiary and then just blatantly violate all the organic rules and then get fined $5,000 is basically a green light to violate all the rules. Um, and so using something like the corner, I hope they still exist. I haven't looked at that site in a couple of years, but um, the but using some metric to like that to verify that you're actually getting real organic products that actually do follow the standards is important rather than just assuming that because it says organic on the label it is. And then avoiding factory farmed meat and getting uh, meat raised on pasture as grain free as possible would be important from the animal foods. And I guess given what I just said, that would be especially true when you're consuming bones.
So, what was your personal experience with the C word? Because I know that you put out that you had it and your experience with it. And then also, did you get the jab? And if so, or if you didn't, what was your reasoning behind that?
I've gotten the C word at least twice, if not three times, and I've never gotten the jab and definitely never will. So the first time was I probably got infected late January 2020 because my first day of symptoms was February 1st, 2020. And so obviously I have no testing verifying that, but the symptoms incredibly line up with it. So do the demographics of who got sick around me and the circumstances in which I got sick. And so that, I'm a C word OG in that. Um, that was probably the sickest I'd ever been in my life. Not that I've ever been like fatally ill or anything, but or and not that I was then, but it was like a really bad flu. But I haven't gotten the flu since I was a teenager, and so like I've gotten like colds since then, and so it was it was definitely as sick as I'd been since I last had the flu. And although I can't remember, and I'm not sure how much it makes sense to compare at my age to like when I was 15, um, I think it might have been worse than any flu that I'd had. Um, I the One of the dead giveaways of the nature of the illness was that I had dramatically altered sense of taste, and so in particular, my sweet taste had been so blunted that I needed like I could barely eat anything at all for about 4 days. And during that time, the only way that I could tolerate anything was if it was exceedingly sweet. I was like ordering on Seamless these sugar sweetened fruit smoothies because I couldn't stand anything else. Um, because basically the natural sweet and bitter. I mean, even if you're eating like meat, it has natural sweet and bitter taste. It just doesn't taste sweet because the sweet taste is so trace. But when you when you totally lose your sweet taste, everything tastes really bitter. And so things that were mildly bitter, which usually I love mildly bitter things. Like I love IPAs, well, like craft IPAs. I love the taste of coffee, and my favorite mineral water is Gerolsteiner, which is very high in minerals and therefore has quite a bitter taste. All those and I crave coffee and Gerolsteiner mineral water, and those tasted absolutely disgusting to me. Um, Another thing that I also got very dehydrated, and I developed, like in the third or fourth day, I developed a very severe sore throat, and somehow I intuitively realized that it was from dehydration. I don't know how I realized that, but I like, it was very hard for me to drink water, and if I did drink water, I didn't retain any of it, and it wasn't hydrating me. And I had gotten a lot of free Element, the salt heavy electrolyte mix, which happens to be sweetened with stevia, and and that kind of got that, like, cured my sore throat very rapidly. And I think the salt was like the limiting factor for me hydrating, and the fact that it was sweet when I was in that taste with my in that situation with my taste so deranged made it like much easier to get down. Um, and so that was one of the symptoms. Another, I I was, I mean, during the period where I couldn't eat, I also couldn't get up. Like, I would move from the bed to laying on the living room couch for the day. That was kind of my life during that period of time, because I couldn't really like get up and do anything. And I didn't take my temperature, but I probably had a wild fever because I was just like alternating between like shivering and sweating crazily. It was nuts. Um, and then I did, for a while, I didn't think it was a C word because I didn't have a dry cough. Although I later found out that like none of the symptoms that they were mentioning were had by the majority of people. Like even the taste thing, which is highly specific to it, is still not not shared. I think even by a 2/3 majority. Neither is fever, neither is dry cough. It's just like there's a spectrum of what people have, and most people have a few of them, but almost no one has all of them. But I did have this very weird symptom that seemed more located like in my throat or my, I don't know if it was my voice box or what, but when I would exhale, it would make this clicking noise, and that other people could hear, not just myself. And I don't. That was my main respiratory. Well, my main, like, I guess it's lower respiratory, mid respiratory, whatever symptom.
Do you know why? I've never heard that. I mean, I heard you talk about that before, but do you know why that maybe happened or?
No idea. No idea. No. Um, and then I, so then the jab came out, and my reason for not getting it was that I had already had the C word, so why bother? Um, I mean, there were other reasons as well. Like, I had no, I was saying before, like, even drugs have much better phase 3 safety trials, and they still get recalled after market. So I think it's like totally, if a new drug comes out, I think it's a totally reasonable position to say, well, I'm not in any kind of dire need for this drug, so I'll wait till it's out for 5 or 10 years and see what it looks like at that point, because you never have like super good data on its safety profile until then. The idea that a placebo-controlled trial, even at the 6 month mark, there most people, like, in the main most common brand, the P word one, the 6 month mark of the safety data had 40% of people had between 4 and 6 months of follow up. 8% of people had more than 6 months of follow up, and everyone else had less than 4 months of follow up. So it was really like it should be called the up to 4 to 6 month data is what it should be called. And so it's sort of like a joke to say that we know the safety profile of something at that point. Um, but it was less. I mean, my decision was less that I positively believed that I shouldn't get it. It was just more like that I had no reason to think about it because I had already gone through the disease, you know. But then in July of 2021, I excuse me, I in July of 2021 I got it again, and at that point I'd gained a lot of weight in 2020, and I was losing it very rapidly at that point. I was eating 1,000 calories a day, and I was losing 0.6 pounds per day, and that's really destructive to your immunity. And so I don't think I would have gotten sick otherwise, but I I went to visiting some family, and I was in a place that was kind of crowded for the weekend, and came back, and I got it again. I would say that it was 10 times less severe then. So it took me a year and a half to get it again. It was 10 times less severe. Um, it was probably Delta, and the data on that are not totally clear, but you could make a case that it should have been more severe rather than less. But certainly with the context that made me get sick, I was certainly in the position where I should have gotten more sick rather than less sick. Um, and so I kind of feel like I had still had 30-fold protection against severity, just judging on the fact that circumstances were such that it probably should have been 2 or 3 times worse had I not had any immunity, and it was actually 10 times less severe. The symptoms were not all the same, but they overlapped a lot, and they were all weaker. So like I didn't have that clicking sound that time, and I did have a dry cough that time, so that was different. Um, but I had a fever, and I was measuring my temperature, and I wasn't measuring it the first time, but just based on my symptoms, I don't think my fever was anywhere near as bad as it was the first time. The fatigue is probably the most obvious example where it clearly wasn't affecting me as much, because I actually had a full week of work that I couldn't get out of, and I could have gotten out of it, but I didn't. And that itself probably made me get a lot sicker than I otherwise would have. But I had like a full day of I had like 2 full days of consulting, and then I had an AMA scheduled for my membership audience. And it's kind of funny, like you can just with some of the questions I was answering, where I was trying to think through biochemistry, it's just so you can sort of tell that I have a fever while I'm doing it. I didn't realize I had a fever at that point, but I was feeling out of it. Um, and then I was doing like manual labor, helping a friend assemble furniture, and so obviously I wasn't anywhere near as fatigued. Although in retrospect, I probably would have been a lot less sick if I had taken the week to rest. Um, but my someone said to me at that point, "Do you have the C word again?" And I was like, "No, definitely not." I was thinking, "No way," because it was so bad the time before, and it wasn't that bad then. And then I was like, "You know what? I have the test. I'm gonna go drink some Gerolsteiner, and if it tastes good, then I don't have it. And if it tastes terrible, then I have it." So I go and I taste it. And it tasted neutral. It was like flat. Like all the joy was gone from it, but it didn't taste bad. And
And
it
it
just,
just
tasted a little metallic, but not in a bad way, just in a kind of like very like neutral way. And I was like, huh, I don't know what this means. So I got a nose test, and it was positive on day 6, um, and a rapid one. And then I followed that up with IgM antibodies. IgM antibodies will be high with a recent infection, and they were. So I have 2 things corroborating that that's what it was. Um, and then the third time was on Christmas. My mom got it, and I took care of her with and I was staying with her for a couple days. Took care of her. Didn't really take any precautions except like we'd hug but not kiss. And so if I could get it, I should have definitely gotten it. But I so when I left to come back home, I had a little bit of a sore throat, and this was, sore throat was big with the variant at that time, and I tested twice, 2 days in a row. I tested negative with a rapid test, but I was only testing my nose, and I think it's quite possible that if I'd swabbed my throat, it would have been positive, and that it's possible that I'd gotten it for a third time, but it was the O variant, and because of that, and because I'd gotten it in July, the severity was basically reduced to like a minor sore throat that had we not been obsessed with this thing, wouldn't have even thought about whether it was anything in particular. Would have just moved on with life. So at least 2 times I got it, possibly 3. Oh, and the jab. No, I mean now I definitely wouldn't get it. I think it's incredibly clear that the public health authorities are completely obfuscating the data. I think they're obviously hiding the real effects of it, and I think the data that is being published everywhere is borderline worthless. I think it's exceedingly clear in a way that it wasn't last year, that we're constantly surrounded by lies about it. And I would never, ever, ever even dream of thinking of getting it. So, I mean, among those, we like just to illustrate how much total nonsense we're bombarded with is, they'll talk about hospitalizations for this, and they'll talk about, such and such are jabbed and such percentage are not. They're leaving out 2 like huge elephants in the room. So one is that 79% of people who are hospitalized for C-word like illness test negative, and about almost 2/3 of them are jabbed. Actually, among those who test negative, it's probably 2/3 or higher are jabbed. And so when they say that, when they calculate, they have this study model that I just consider a scam. It's called the test negative case control study. And in a test negative case control study, this is a study where you take your whole sample are all equally sick, and then you test them for the pathogen of interest. And if the jab makes them test negative, that's how you calculate the efficacy. And so this is perfectly illustrative of how modern medicine can not at all be about health. It's ironic that the people who say that style themselves as evidence-based, who are all about clinical outcomes, all hold up jabs as this sacred cow that can't be criticized. And yet 90% of jab efficacy studies between pre-C-word, so between 2011 and 2018, for all of them, were these test negative case control studies. And so you look at this and you think, the worst possible interpretation of this, apart from everyone being dead in the study, would be if like it was all paralyzed children. And so that's exactly how they calculate the polio efficacy, for the polio jab. They take tens of thousands of people who have acute flaccid myelitis, acute flaccid paralysis, which literally used to be called polio. Okay, so polio did not refer to a virus at first because they didn't know what caused it. Like for a while, they thought it was teething powder that caused it. And it was possible that it was caused by the teething powder. Teething powder was really high in heavy metals, and they were giving it to babies to like help them through the teething process. At the time that polio just suddenly appeared out of nowhere in like the 1890s, and then so when they decided that it was the polio virus that caused it, and then with the jab, they eradicated the polio virus from most of the world, but children were still getting paralyzed. They relabeled it acute flaccid paralysis, and it is mechanistically it's exactly the same disease. So it's damage to a very specific type of cell in the spinal cord that causes a very specific type of paralysis. So acute flaccid paralysis literally is the clinical polio phenotype. It's just now that in the developing world, I don't know anyone that's gotten it in the baby because I grew up in the U.S. So something that got rid of it that was not the polio jab in the modern West, because in the developing world they have tens of thousands of kids getting acute flaccid paralysis every year, like in India, Pakistan, etc., Somalia, um, and and so um, and so they came up with this list of other causes of acute flaccid paralysis. So if you look at any of these polio papers, it says um, acute flaccid paralysis can be caused by the polio virus, but it can also be caused by this list of other things. There's other enteroviruses and autoimmune disorders, including things that are known side effects of all jabs, like I forget how to pronounce it, Guillain-Barré syndrome or whatever, can cause acute flaccid uh, paralysis. And so, on top of it, in the developing world, they give the live polio virus, and actually, it's not a jab; um, it's a oral one. So I don't know what you want to nickname it, but anyway, um, it actually has the live virus in it, unlike the one that they used to kill the virus for us, and they give them the live one. But anyway, and that also can cause it. So what they do in these studies, they take tens of thousands of kids with acute flaccid paralysis. Everyone's equally paralyzed, and then they give them a stool test for type 1, type 2, type 3 polio virus. Type 2 is the one that comes in the oral jab, the pill, right? Type 2 is the one that comes in the pill. And so if the kid tests positive for type 2, they exclude them from the study. And so like in one they had something like 40 or 60,000 kids with acute flaccid paralysis. 5% of them had type 2 polio virus in their stool. So you know that it was caused by the pill. And so they exclude them from the analysis. And then they separate them between those who tested positive for type 1 or type 3 and those who tested negative. And so if the ones who got the pill were more likely to test negative for type 1 or type 3, remember, if they tested positive for type 2, they're excluded because we know the pill caused it. They calculate that the pill is 95% effective at preventing polio because if you are paralyzed with the exact clinical phenotype of polio, the pill makes you get a negative stool test for it, right? The only thing that can be worse than this is, I joke that the most effective jab that could ever be developed is one that in a test negative case control study where exclusively you enroll dead people, the jab is shown to be effective at every known cause of death. You know, so like if you just got a list of all the things that could cause you to die that are known, and obvious, like they're dead, so obviously the cause must not be known. But if you can show that the jab makes you test negative for all of those in the dead people, then it's 100% effective against every known cause of death. Like what you don't see in the headline is that everyone's dead, right? So these C-word efficacy studies are doing the exact same thing. And it's funny because I spent most of like 2021 getting bombarded by this, like, how can you be against the jab? The jab is what got rid of polio. I spent most of 2021 being like, the C word has nothing to do with polio. What are you talking about? Why are you even bringing up polio? No, I've completely changed my mind about this. The C word is exactly like polio because even the polio stuff is total BS. I couldn't believe how like irredeemably corrupt this science is when I looked at it. Like this is way worse than stuff that the like anti-jabbers say about the RCTs, which is that they minimize the side effects by instead of using a saline placebo, by using like the meningococcal jab, which is like known to have side effects. With the C word, they actually didn't do that. They use saline in most of the trials except the British one. But anyway, like this is tremendously worse because they're defining efficacy against testing negative for the cause of the thing that you have, right? So C word like illness, these people are hospitalized with respiratory failure, dyspnea, which is trouble breathing, pneumonia, cough, fever, vomiting, and or diarrhea. Like that was a set of things that they defined C word like illness. They're all hospitalized, right? So it's serious enough to be hospitalized, right? And so they define efficacy by getting a negative test. And despite the fact that 57% of the people with C word like illness who are hospitalized are jabbed, and the 79% that test negative are like those are mostly jabbed people, and that's why it's effective. But they're all hospitalized with the same symptoms, and so that data is nonsense. And then it gets worse than that. So now there's hospital systems or states that are coming out and saying that if someone tests positive in the hospital, that there's roughly a 40% chance that the reason they're hospitalized is because they have C word like illness. Like 60 something percent of the hospitalizations that test positive are people that like broke a leg and then the hospital made them get tested and it came back positive. So that means that 79% of the people who are there with the illness test negative, and 60 something percent of the people who test positive don't have the illness, right? So the data that we're subjected to about C word hospitalizations is total complete nonsense. It's like so completely obfuscatory that we don't have just, and actually I'm in the process of working with a lawyer to submit a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, for the data on among these hospitalizations, what's the ICU rate and the death rate among the people that tested negative according to their jab status? Like, is if in fact the people with C word like illness that are testing negative and are jabbed are not dying of it, why aren't they publishing the data? I mean, that might be true, right? Like it might be very possible that the people who are jabbed and test negative for the C word are not going to the ICU and are not dying. But why won't they publish that in the data that they do release? It just looks like they're hiding it. Similarly, with all-cause mortality, right? All-cause mortality is the metric that you would want to look at, because you can argue about whether someone died of the C word or with the C word, and you can argue whether a 23-year-old who dies in his sleep of a cardiac embolism 3 days after he got the third one died after it or because of it. But whether someone dies is not controversial, like except in like very few cases like Presley or Jim Morrison or something like that. Like whether someone dies is super objective. And so the data that you should look at that integrates like not all, because someone can have long-term symptoms and not die, but the data that very objectively integrates risk and reward together in a way that is not amenable to manipulation or to very serious problems with interpretation, right? Like someone who has post illness or jab fatigue is like, it's very hard to interpret. It's very hard to interpret how bad the fatigue is, what caused it, etc. But if we can just look at something like, in the 6 months following getting the jab, like how many people died who got it and how many people died who didn't as a percentage of that population, that's a very simple, basic metric that should be the first metric that we look at for anything. It should be the crowning metric that is most publicized, and it's nowhere to be found. So in the closest case that they tried to tell us about, they looked at non-C word mortality. So they didn't look at total mortality. They looked at non-C word mortality. And they wanted to look at the effect of the jab. And so they compared people who got jabbed for the C word, not to people who didn't get jabbed for the C word, but very specifically to people who didn't get jabbed with the C word, but did get jabbed for the flu at least once in the last 2 years. Now you look at that and you're like, why so specific? Like, this is a very curious way of finding the control group, because we just want to know about the people who got jabbed and didn't. So like, why are we being so very specific? So they say the reason that and so first of all, whenever someone shows you the adjusted data and they don't show you the data that they're adjusting it from, you know you're getting scammed. Like, it doesn't matter what the study could be about, whether like blueberries cause your blood sugar to rise or something, like it could, anything random. Like, if you see the study and they do some fancy adjustments to it and they don't just show you the basic data that they adjusted it from, you assume that you're being scammed, right? And so the normal thing to do in this case would have been to show the total mortality in jabbed versus unjabbed, and then say that's in table 1, but we want to focus on these adjustments that we made for these reasons, right? So first of all, why'd they use non C word mortality instead of total mortality? Like, C word mortality is not even in there. What they say is, because we expect the jab to lower C word mortality, we just looked at non C word mortality. Like, that alone is really weird. Like, what they should say is, as expected, as shown in table 1, the jab reduced C word mortality. Moving on, right? Like, that is just the most basic thing, to like put the basic data in there. But they say, because we expected it to do that, we didn't look at it. So they only show you non-C word mortality as a proxy for total mortality. I have a FOIA request that I'm hoping to submit soon about this as well. Then the reason for picking this flu jab control group is, they said they wanted to control for healthcare seeking behavior. So what that means is, we don't want to wind up with a healthy user bias. This sounds like very meritorious on the surface. We didn't want to wind up with a healthy user bias where the people who, as I was saying before, the more conscientious people who follow the recommendations to get the jab are healthier for other reasons. We didn't want that. So we wanted to control for healthcare seeking behavior. Now, as I said before, even if that's a good argument, what they should have done is presented the total unjabbed group and then said, okay, now we're going to put this control on top of it. The fact that they didn't is a red flag in the first place. But there's something very weird about that choice, right? Because what on earth would make someone so eager to get the flu jab in the 2 years before this and make them so intransigent to resist all social pressure, threat of job loss, and everything else in the period of time that followed for the C word jab? I mean, you can think of reasons, but obviously those people aren't similar in their healthcare seeking behavior. Like, there's something peculiar about the person who usually gets the flu jab every year and then is resistant to this one. But then when you see the results prove that choice didn't work. Why? Because what they showed was that the C word jab is associated with a 50% reduction in non-C word mortality. Oh, by the way, so I'm also working with someone there was a paper that argued that the C word that argued that the flu jab reduces C word mortality. And I could not find any papers ever published on whether the flu jab reduces total mortality. And I've been corresponding with Brian Hooker, the lead scientist for Children's Health Defense. He wrote a criticism of this paper that they actually it's too confusing to explain the details, but they basically divided their line by 1 and showed the reciprocal of it, which meant that their conclusions were opposite, and that the flu jab would be increasing the C word mortality. So just this choice alone is it's so unclear whether the flu affects mortality, because there's nothing published on it that's reliable and clear. And there's very iffy, like, you know, whatever. It's very unclear. But anyway, if the so what they found, right, was that the C word jab is associated with 50% reduced risk of non-C word mortality. Like, if this is a biological thing, it's very remarkable. So like what it like if you get shot, it heals the wound faster, or it, you know, decreases like the death from every respiratory virus across the board. Like, what does that mean? So what did they think it means? Well, what they said was this shows that there is that there was a healthy how do I put this in code word, jabby effect, like a healthy user effect applied to the jab, that that basically they were basically the people who got the flu jab but not the C word jab were particularly unhealthy people for totally irrelevant reasons, and the people who got the C word jab were particularly healthy people for totally irrelevant reasons. So they took this control group. Remember, they said the justification was we are controlling for healthcare seeking behavior. Their explanation of their main effect was we did not control for health seeking behavior. Like they basically, their whole conclusion is that their choice of control did not work. Right? They're trying to control for this bias that they then invoke to explain their results. Um, in any sane world, they would have gone back to the drawing table and saying they would have said this control group sucks. Like, let's go back to square one. What's jabbed versus unjabbed? What's a better way to control for it? So like, it's bizarre that this stuff. The reason that this gets published is because it gets published in MMWR, which is the, you know, Centers for whatever journal that's not peer reviewed. And in fact, if you Google is MMWR peer reviewed, what you'll find is the Centers for, you know, whatever our code word is, saying although it's not peer reviewed like a traditional medical journal, it's peer reviewed to make sure it comports with our policy. So this journal is just like willing to publish any nonsense if it supports policy, right? And so I mean, to summarize, we don't know all-cause mortality. I mean, we could go to the trials, right, where we have slightly more mortality in the jab group, but that's pretty useless because the trials weren't designed to show mortality effects. They were done in relatively low-risk people who were not expected to die of the C word, and they didn't have a lot of deaths. But, you know, so just across the board, we have no good evidence on total mortality. And what we have on C word hospitalizations is, you know, hopelessly confounded by the fact that they're talking about the 21% of C word like illness in the hospitals, and they're ignoring 79% of the C word illness in the hospitals in order to make their point. And so these things, like, why is the jab making people get hospitalized for C word illness and test negative? I mean, there's a few possible reasons. I mean, if you just assume, of course, all of this assumes that correlation is causation, but that's what we have, right there. If we just take, either we assume it's meaningless, or we assume that there's some meaning to it. And if there's some meaning to it, it could be that the jab is, it could be that these, first of all, these people might have had the C word, or they might not have. They might have had a different virus. If they had the C word, then it would appear that the jab is clearing, you know, maybe with antibody dependent enhancement, is clearing the virus from the nose faster, but is causing a cytokine storm that is giving them worse symptoms. So by the time they're in the hospital, maybe they would have tested positive a few days before, but by the time they get tested in the hospital, they've already cleared it from their nose, but the inflammation systemically is so high that they have a worse case of illness. That's one possible reason. Another would be viral competition. Sometimes if you stop yourself from getting one virus, you get another virus. So maybe they're more likely to get a different respiratory virus because they had such a strong effect in reducing the C word virus. And then another possibility is that they're just sick with side effects. So it might not be antibody dependent enhancement, but it might be like cytokines that are totally unprovoked by a virus, which we know happens. Like if you just look at the cytokine profile that is caused by the second shot, it looks very similar to the cytokine storm that kills people from the C word. And so, and that's, it's not like that's not supposed to happen. I mean, you are trying to provoke an immune response, but the point is that some of those people are obviously going to get more of an immune response than others. And perhaps a portion of them are getting such an exaggerated response that they get hospitalized for something that doesn't have a virus, but looks a lot like they do. So those are like the three possibilities, and all of them demand some kind of investigation. But that's not what happens. What happens is you have to go to like the table in the paper to find this, and they just ignore the 79%, and they say, well, a third shot was 90% effective against this variant, 95% effective against that one, against C word hospitalizations. And anyone who hears that thinks that if they get the C word, they're not going to the hospital. But what they meant is if they're in the hospital for the illness, they're going to test negative for it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that there is no honesty in this data, like anyone who understands that total lack of honesty, like would say, well, I'm going to wait until I have some idea what the heck is going on.
Right. Or ask, why is the stuff being manipulated in the way that it is? And then along those lines, we don't have to get too deep into this, but I don't remember the name of the woman that you interviewed, but she was talking about how she and Dr. Peter McCulloch published a study on myocarditis and how the paper got accepted and then they completely got rid of it and didn't give them a reason for it. And it was just trying to educate people on the fact that this can happen. I don't remember exactly, but that to me was another red flag. Like, okay, why are these peer-reviewed journals trying to hide that information as well from the public?
Yeah, that was Jessica Rose. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. The fact that they're trying to silence people is a clear indication that they don't anyone who won't allow the other side to talk obviously doesn't trust the soundness of their own position. I mean, that's the only reason you would ever not allow someone else to talk. And so I do think that any attempts of censorship should be seen as basically opposite, is almost as evidence that the censored thing is true. Because if it's not, why else would you censor it instead of just arguing against it? It's just like, I mean, that's simple to me. But the myocarditis thing might be worse than anyone thinks. So there was just a paper that was dropped today. We're recording February 15th, and this looked at in a cohort. This was like drawn from the electronic health records in Kaiser Permanente, where rather than relying on self-reporting of the myocarditis, they just look at wherever it occurred and was in the medical records. And what they found is that it's underreported in VAERS by a factor of 48. And so that's close to the worst estimates that people would use for an underreporting factor, because the most extreme underreporting ever found was a factor of 100. And but there's the cynics have been saying that it might be between 10 and 100, and the cheerleaders have been saying that the media is making people over-report to VAERS, and it looks like it's in the cynical range.
Yeah, cool.
Well, we're gonna close this episode but thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this good information. I like how you break everything down so clearly, and it's like, just getting straight to the facts or just the lack of, and so we really appreciate the important work that you're doing.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
For anyone that doesn't know where to find you, how do they find you? If they want to sign up for your class or do one-on-ones with you, and then other platforms that you may be
social
on.
media.
I am at chrismasterjohnphd.com. I'm Chris Masterjohn, spelled just like my name with no spaces or punctuation on social, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and I'm increasingly on a few others, Telegram, Gab, Getter, Rumble. But I highly recommend everyone go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/uncensored and sign up for my newsletter, because I'm being pretty heavily, like on Instagram, where I've been threatened with account deletion. You can't find me unless you type in all the right letters, and then it asks you if you're sure you want to follow me because I spread misinformation, and you can't tag me, and they're like suppress, like people will like my post and it'll disappear, and then they'll like it again and it'll disappear and stuff like that. So and in fact, I think they're also, like, every time I get a follower, they're like making someone unfollow me, because my follower count has like remained at this same decimal point for like months at a time. Like really really suspicious that they're just like, one follower comes in, they cut one out. But anyway, chrismasterjohnphd.com/uncensored. That's my newsletter, where you will specifically, you'll hear from me with all my important stuff, but especially if my content gets taken down. For example, the Jessica Rose interview and the Stephanie Seneff interview that I did, both of them have been removed by YouTube, and I'm 2 strikes away from getting deplatformed on YouTube. So highly recommend everyone go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/uncensored, and that's where you will make sure that you stay connected with me no matter what kind of efforts the tech companies make to separate us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.